we've gone sort of broad. We've been inspired by Saskia and Richard's talk very broadly about the challenge in front of us, thinking about biodiversity conservation in a changing world. And now we want to come down to start the sort of work part of these 2 days, which is about, as you would have seen in the paper that was the discussion paper that was sent to you, is about thinking really hard about these, what we're sort of labelling shifts. And as Ryan said, there's been a really broad consultation, talking with lots of people, lots of conversations, but then we had to distill that down into something that's manageable. And so those shifts are articulated in the discussion paper are an attempt to try to reduce down all of that complexity of those discussions to say, what does this future look like? What does conservation look like in this kind of future-ready idea? So I'm just going to run through quickly about those shifts, and then we're going to move into some work after the break. Before I do, I just want to really acknowledge, or 2 things. One is I want to echo Richard's comments earlier, which is I'm lucky enough too to work, both here and overseas a lot. You're the only state in Australia that's capable, I think, of having this conversation. So nowhere else in Australia, I think, could you get people together like this. And it's because of the leadership of both the environment sector, but also within government. And I've just come back from overseas yesterday, and I was talking about this process with people who are working internationally, and no one's aware of a group of people that are actually trying to reimagine what we think about, the way we think about conservation in this kind of changing climate. So I think you need to really genuinely be proud of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve, acknowledge that it's really difficult, but you're on a pretty amazing journey that very few other people on the planet are on, and people are already starting to ask about this process and what's coming out, and they want to look to this process to guide their own conversations. As a part of that, I think one of the really important things, lots of people doing lots of things, but 2 people in particular have been very brave and also worked very hard, is Vicky Jo Russell, who we heard Craig mention before, but also Vicky Linton from Juna. They're just fantastic leadership. Genuinely, both of them are very nervous about, and have been very nervous at times about where we're going with this process, but they've always stuck to the fact that, we've got to, if we want to do something, if we want to get somewhere and make real progress, we've got to do something different. And I still go back to when Vicky stood up in front of a whole room full of people like this and said, you need to help us do this, to do something different, because if you leave it to government, you know what you'll get the same, and that's, a sort of, I guess that's a reflection on bureaucracy. But Vicky said, we need you to help us to go somewhere different, and they've stuck to that, and they really need to be acknowledged for that, so thank you. Thank you. So we've referred to these kind of key ideas, it's hard to say, key ideas, these 9 key ideas that we've sort of referred to them as shifts, but they're not finished. These are propositions. So this is not a done deal. This is not the way government is going. This is what we've heard. This is what we've distilled down to these 9 ideas that we want to test with you today and tomorrow are about testing that. As Ryan said earlier, this is about gut feel and finding out, are we on the right track? Does this make sense? If not, what does make sense? I'm going to run through them, and then after the break, we're going to have some time to work in small groups around the tables to talk about these individual shifts, and I'll talk about the design of that in a minute. But they kind of fall into 2 groups, the shifts. One is about doing the work, so it's about how we do conservation in the future and what we need to think about, and the other group are about the work behind the work. So, what enables us to continue to do the work? So they sort of fall into these 2 categories. The first set are around doing the work, and these are numbered, and you might want to just take note of ones that kind of resonate with you, because after the break you might want to go and spend some time talking about that at a table. So if one of these kind of really creates some kind of reaction in you, good or bad, you might want to just take note. So what do we mean by this? Value nature in all its forms, including novel and urban, and we heard Richard talk about novel ecosystems. This is I think this is one of the hardest things for all of us in this room as passionate people about conservation, is to conceptualise what we mean by this kind of shift, which is from purely natural as good, so the standard has been natural, things have to be natural, and Richard talked about that as an objective of a lot of conservation work, which is to restore things back to natural. And the shift is towards this nature is good. Connecting people and humans with nature is a good thing to do. the nature we're surrounded by in the parks and cities is a part of the way human beings experience and enjoy themselves and their life, and we need to acknowledge that as a sector. Most people, their interactions with nature are in the parks here and in their gardens as their first and foremost interaction with nature. As a sector, that's a real challenge, but we also need to be realistic about what's happening. Every ecosystem in South Australia is changing. Some are changing more than others, some are changing faster than others, but we need to acknowledge that ecosystems are changing from the legacy, as Richard talked about, of the whole range, legacy of past events, but also new events like climate change. So where does our thinking sit? Are we about keeping things as they are now, or are we about aiming for what's going to happen in the future? What do we do about benchmarks? They have to change. Our benchmarks need to be recalibrated. The climate's changed over the top of ecosystems. Is it realistic to expect that we can take something back to here if the climate over the top has changed? So there's some real challenges for the way we think about and measure and plan and the sort of objectives we set. The second one is around that we have to acknowledge that the benefits we've got of nature at the moment are because of the past management of it, because of good and bad, but particularly the bravery and the work of people who worked hard to recognise the benefits and the uniqueness of biodiversity in South Australia, and worked hard to get national parks established and conservation reserves. We heard the story of someone chaining themselves to the power pole, which is kind of interesting. They're chaining themselves to a power pole to save some nature, but we need to think about the legacy that we've inherited, that we've got, that we obviously need to keep doing a lot of the same things. Some of the things we do really make sense. But we also, we know we need to change some things. We don't want to throw out what works, but we need to do things that are smart now and smart in 50 years' time. We want people getting together in a forum in 50 years' time to say they really made good decisions back then in 2017 and 2018 about these types of things because it set us up with another good legacy. So how do we ensure that we're making the best decisions we can now that set us up for the future we're likely to inherit? That's a real challenge. As Richard said, we don't particularly know what the right thing to do is. We don't know how most of our ecosystems work, even the dominant species, and we're learning a lot of new information all the time about the limits of ecosystems. So we need to think about robustness, things that are very robust to the widest range of futures that we might have, keep doing those things that we know work, but also starting to experiment with other things, particularly where change is inevitable. Where there's going to be lots of change, we can start to think about how can we experiment with what else we might need to try. The third shift is about kind of getting better and evolving our thinking and our approaches to help guide our thinking about priorities in this world of uncertainty, with a lot more uncertainty. Both there's uncertainty around climate change and how climate will affect and how much it will actually change in itself. There's uncertainty around how ecosystems respond to that change, and there's also uncertainty around how we as a society will respond to that change. Those three types of uncertainty all are intertwined, and we actually can't say with any confidence even about one of those, let alone the interaction of three of those. And so it makes thinking and planning for the future really complex, and certainly the idea of setting really tight targets for 50 years out or 30 years out doesn't make a lot of sense. So we need to think differently about the way we plan and think about the future. So this is a hard shift too. It's thinking about being very safe. We can be very conservative and say, this is what we've always done, let's continue to do it. That would be the safest thing for us to do. But we have to think about being experimental. We have to think about trying new things in the landscape, particularly where change is inevitable. In some places, what have we got to lose? So that's a real challenge. That's a real challenge for how we do that as for personally, but it's a real challenge how we do it as a whole sector of people and of working in partnership with government and other partners. How can we give people the confidence about what we want to do, but also be experimenting with things? Not easy stuff. 4 is around that we need to manage threats, including pests, plants and animals, in ways that better link to our desired outcomes. So we heard Richard talk a little bit about this as well, and there's a kind of rigidity, if you like, in focusing on what we don't want. So conservation has been structured around the changes we don't want, but how can we shift that towards being much clearer about what we do want? And what do we base that on? These are complex discussions around values and what people hold true to themselves and their worldviews, and that's very diverse across society. And so us as a group can decide this is what conservation should be, but is that realistic for when you've got 1.5 million people in the state with a whole range of views? And so how do we bring those views together and think about what are the realistic goals given the types of changes that we might experience? How do we bring those things together? And all of that in a context of declining resources. So there are some things about doing the work. Then there's some things about the work behind the work. And this is number 5. Our decision making needs to be collaborative, influential and informed by the values, knowledge and rules of society. For a lot of us, if you come from a technical background, our assumption has been that people out there just need some information, that there's a technical deficit, a knowledge or an information deficit, and that if we can explain to people why this thing is important because it's threatened or it's rare, or why it's important because it does a particular job, we assume that people will act. We all know that there's plenty of information about the problems of biodiversity, so it's not an information problem. Anyone can Google the term biodiversity, you can Google, and pull up a huge amount of information. That doesn't change people's values. It's part of the story, but it's only a small part. We also need to align the values that society holds and that individuals hold, and we need to align that with the rules. And we know when you look at those, many of the problems we're trying to manage, those 3 things don't align. The values, the knowledge, and the rules don't align. If we can work through processes that bring some of those things closer together, that make it easier for people to make decisions, decision makers in power, where they feel confident that we have those things aligned, decisions get made. When a decision is difficult, it's because there's not strong alignment between those things. I'm not sure about here, but certainly in New South Wales, there's examples where people actually can't do the right thing because the rules are set up to do something else, or forcing them to do something in a particular way. And there's examples in this state where people are continuing to make decisions about funding, for example, because it's what the legislation tells you have to do, what you have to spend particular money on. The shift here is, and we heard this earlier, is about trying to move from this idea of sort of polarised arguments that, conservation is good or bad, that, there's black or white, and start to move towards this idea of informed discussion. So we know that, we don't have the resources as a sector that many of the other sectors have got to bring to bear. So we know that, for example, you can change Australian public community's perception of an issue for about $20 million. Mining companies have done it, the gambling lobby's done it. It costs them about $20 to $25 million to change a federal government decision. We're never going to have those resources, and every time we bump up against that, that's the sort of resources that we are coming up against. So as a sector, how are we going to engage in those really complex societal debates? There's at times when it makes real sense for us, and as Craig said, it makes real sense for us to be in direct opposition. We need that sometimes. We do need polarised debates. But for a lot of the stuff we're talking about, polarised debates actually don't help us go forward very much. It's working out when's the right time to fight and when's the right time to take another avenue. 6 is, about learning, and learning is a serious business, particularly in the context of the amount of uncertainty that we've got to deal with. And the shift here, and everyone in this room is going to understand this, is from reporting to learning. We're spending an enormous amount of resources. In fact, the large proportion of our resources are getting tied up in the sort of bureaucracy of the system, and that's not a comment on government, it's a consistent all over. And I've been working with the development industry in Africa, and it's got to the point in the development industry that there's more resources going into accountability and reporting than there are going into on ground. That's crazy, and we're heading the same way as an industry. If we don't step in and work out how do we simplify reporting and get the shift onto learning, and a lot of people in this room will know about my loan campaign to kill off Merry as a concept, and reframe it as adaptive management or adaptive learning or whatever we want to call it, but MERI is about reporting. That's a task that needs to be done for accountability. That's fine, that's a given. We're talking about learning our way forward in complex settings. That's a very different thing to reporting. Unfortunately, the tail's wagging the dog, and I think as a sector, as a group of people, we need to think about how we break that nexus between those. 7 is about you as a group of people and as a sector working together, and we know that if we're going to do the sort of work that we've been talking about and meet the challenge of the future that we've got in front of us, we need a resilient conservation sector that can engage in this long-term conservation thinking, and that means moving from a sort of fringe lobby, and I'm not saying that disparagingly, but to making this a valued profession that we can engage in. And you know, I think at the moment we need nature conservation to be based on the fact that we're passionate, but we're professional about it as well. And professionalism in this industry means, or this sector means, you know, what's the career path for a young person coming into conservation? I was thinking about Saskia, thinking about the future. You know, where are the opportunities for a young person to come into conservation and build a decent career and make enough money to be able to buy a house, etc.? We lose a lot of people like Saskia once they realise this, you know, this industry doesn't support you in the long term. There's not the resources in it. So that perception that conservation is a hobby, not a serious career for us to work in, but that means we need to think about career development and career pathways for people. We also need to look after ourselves in terms of mental health, and Richard raised the issue about, you know, stress and depression and that sort of thing, and this industry is rife with it because we're dealing with these very complex issues that are depressing, but we're also under enormous stress, and I see lots of people who are under enormous stress, and I think it's concerning for us as a whole sector. 8 is around strengthening the narrative around nature, and this has come up in different ways throughout the conversation already today, but instead of thinking of nature as separate, it's nature as central to the lives of South Australians. And this is, I think, about the idea of getting much broader support for nature conservation in the state. So how do we get people involved, people out there going about their day-to-day lives, how do we get them to have the same passion, to have the same interest? Education was mentioned, that's part of it, of course. But, you know, we educate people about a lot of things that don't translate into behaviour. Smoking, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's all sorts of risks and dangers we educate and spend a lot of money educating people on, but actually it doesn't translate. People still do those things. It's the same with education, and I think it's also unfair of us as a kind of group of people now to put that so much onto the next generation and to future generations. What can we do now that's about changing the narrative about nature conservation? So there's things around changing the language, around from and invoking particular types of language, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But there's things that we can do, small things, to engage people in nature, and we've got lots of ideas and examples where we can engage people in nature in everyday ways in the community, and we'll talk about some of those in the next session. And the last one is around remember what we love about nature and use this to engage other values. So this comes out of work from the Common Cause work, which many of you people in the state have now done some training in or had some exposure to. So this is about going from the language of loss to the language of love. And that's, you know, that sounds kind of corny, and particularly after Valentine's Day, but actually there's really good science to back this up, that if we berate people about the loss of biodiversity, it's likely to activate value systems in people, which will make them disengage and become actually less passionate about biodiversity. And that's really hard for us because I think as a sector, we've relied on telling the negative story. So we've relied on telling people that if you don't do something about this, we're going to lose it. But actually, that can come in later, but the leading kind of edge of the communication should be around, this is what we love about nature, this is what we're passionate about, this is what it's exciting about nature. And I know that sounds corny, but we're silly if we ignore the science. If we use the other language, we're activating values that actually make people greedy. It actually makes people disengage, and it makes them turn inwards and disengage with the message you're trying to promote. We need to get smarter as an organisation, as a whole system of people working together to move towards the narrative of inclusiveness, loving what's out there, loving what we do, to try to activate the right values to then get people to accept the next message, which can be about things are changing and there is loss that we need to worry about. Something, that's going to be hard for us because it's not our traditional language. So there's a whole bunch of things about doing the work. So, and then the work behind the work. Those are these 9 shifts, and I sort of think of them like, they're bones, if you like. We've distilled the stuff down to the bones. But bones can't work in isolation. They're all connected, so those 9 things are actually interconnected, but they set up a kind of overall, a kind of picture.